From what you know about genetics, it may seem like a dominant trait is most likely to be found in a population. However, this is a misconception, and we're going to explain why. You might have heard people say something like redheads will be extinct within the next century or so, because dark hair is dominant. While that may seem to be the case for that trait, this is not always the case. Also, the term dominant may imply that expressing dominant traits is more prevalent or desirable. Polydactyly, which means having extra fingers or toes, or having the fatal genetic condition Huntington's disease, are both caused by the dominant allele, neither of which are particularly desirable, and both of which are present in less than 1% of all births.
Every cell in an individual's body contains 2 copies, alleles, of each gene. One allele comes from the mother, and one allele comes from the father. If someone receives 2 dominant alleles, the dominant trait will be expressed. If an individual receives 1 dominant and 1 recessive allele, the dominant trait will be expressed. Finally, if an individual receives 2 recessive alleles, the recessive trait will be expressed. A trait that is commonly found within a population does not necessarily depend on whether or not it is the dominant or recessive, but rather how frequently the allele is found within a population.
In a larger, diverse population, allele frequencies tend to be more stable. However, in the event of a genetic bottleneck, where the gene pool is suddenly and dramatically reduced, genetic diversity, heterozygosity, and allele frequencies will be significantly altered on a case-by-case basis. The bottleneck effect can be the result of habitat loss, founder effects, disease epidemics, or natural disasters. If we had a diverse population that was dramatically cut down, the alleles present would dictate the alleles of future generations, where what is available will be common simply because it's all that is available, and sometimes this means recessive alleles being most frequent. This often decreases fitness, heterozygosity, and overall genetic variation. Due to a small population procreating for the next generation, inbreeding is common and can carry some questionable side effects.
Inbreeding depression is a reduction in fitness of the offspring from mating individuals within a population and is caused by an increase in the homozygosity of an allele within a population. Inbreeding is when 2 closely related individuals mate, and this often occurs in smaller populations. In smaller populations, there is a decrease in the number of individuals available to mate with. Due to less genetic diversity, if an allele is common within the individuals of a small population, it is likely that this will be passed down to subsequent generations. In terms of inbreeding depression, the prevalence of a deleterious recessive allele that is common within a small population quickly spreads through future generations and is a lot more common than the dominant allele.
In terms of dominant deleterious alleles like Huntington's disease in a large, diverse population, how come the frequency is so low? The Hardy-Weinberg principle states that the frequency of an allele in a population should not change between consecutive generations. This is dependent on 5 factors. No mutation, no natural selection, no immigration or emigration, no mating selection, and lastly, it must be a large population to avoid the effect of genetic drift. Hardy-Weinberg principle demonstrates why having Huntington's disease is dominant but is uncommon. The Hardy-Weinberg principle ensures that the genotype frequencies will remain constant from one generation to the next. However, this is under the assumption that Huntington's isn't advantageous.
All in all, dominant traits are not necessarily the most likely to be found in the population, and sometimes this is good news in terms of fatal Huntington's disease. The Hardy-Weinberg principle tells us about the maintenance of genetic frequency in a stable population, and bottleneck effects show us the negative consequences of lower genetic diversity, which could lead to a high frequency of recessive alleles. Thanks to Hardy-Weinberg, looks like redheads are here to stay after all.